I'm Allison Whalen, and you're listening to The False Trade-Off, a podcast for working parents, HR leaders, and anyone who is committed to proving that working parents can be successful at work and at home, and that it's not an either-or trade-off. Each week, we'll dive into some of the most challenging, complex, and sometimes controversial topics related to parental leave and navigating life as a working parent. Because in order to break the false trade-off, we need to address these topics head-on. There are many different paths to parenthood, and regardless of how one may get there, bringing kids into our worlds is life-changing in many ways. At Parentally, we work with folks who enter parenthood in many different ways. People who give birth or have a partner or former partner who give birth, people who adopt or use a surrogate, but we do not have the pleasure of speaking with folks who are step-parents, since that path doesn't normally involve a parental leave. And that's why I love this podcast. It puts me in a position to share the profound stories of parents whose journeys look a little bit different than the ones I'm surrounded by in my day job. I was so excited to welcome Jen Allen-Knuth to the podcast, who became a step-parent later in her career to 4 wonderful children ages 9 through 18. Before becoming a parent, Jen spent her entire career with one company where she moved up the ranks and created new roles and opportunities for herself before eventually moving on to join a startup. Much of her life revolved around her career, but after a lot of soul-searching about what she actually wanted out of her life, she realized work was not her identity. In this episode, we talk about how expanding her family to include her husband and children has helped give her clarity that her professional experience doesn't dictate her self-worth. We also talk all about how this self-reflection has given her the confidence to finally go out on her own, something she's wanted to do in her career for a while. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Jen, to the False Trade-Off podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pumped to be here with you.
I am excited. I'm also feeling a little bit guilty that I have 30 minutes with you and I'm not even going to ask you about sales tips and tricks because I'm like, I have this amazing resource in front of me and I'm just going to throw that aside. But what I want to talk about more is, you're obviously this amazing, I heard you say you don't like to be called a sales expert, but you're an amazing sales expert. And you've had an incredible career. You spent, I can't even believe it, but 18 plus years at CEB, Gardner, Challenger, climbing the ranks, chief evangelist at Challenger, and then you threw it all up in the air. Tell me, I want to start, we're going to cover a lot of things today about parenthood and career shifts and whatnot. But I want to start with that moment because when I was doing research on your background and your history and all of the wonderful things about you, that struck me as like, what happened? What was the inflection point after all that time that made you throw your life up in the air?
What a killer first question. So I can't say it was one thing. It was probably a combination of things. But I think the leading factor into that decision had a lot to do with my change in role from being a sales rep to the chief evangelist. So when I became the chief evangelist, which is a role that I had created and advocated for with our CEO, it gave me an opportunity to go from a salesperson who's talking to a bunch of customers kind of in a vacuum to having this platform where I had a weekly podcast and I was writing more consistently on LinkedIn. And I think two things that it did was, one, it showed me that maybe I had a little bit more to offer than I initially thought. So I think I had always assumed my value or my worth was relative to the company that I was working for. So I worked for a company I was super proud of, but I think there was probably a bit of me that always thought like, well, my success is tied to that. And stepping out and getting uncomfortable helped me realize that maybe that's not the case. And so number 2 was also just, I felt a pull to more of the things I was doing on the side than I was doing in my full-time job. So specifically, I was booking a lot of opportunities to speak at sales kickoffs and do things like that. And I found myself looking at my day and getting really excited about that stuff and then less excited about the things I was doing in my core job. So it did, frankly, take me a lot of time to build confidence in making the decision to leave because I was so fearful that without a brand behind me, I was just not going to be successful. But I think those two things kept building and building and building to the point where I was like, okay, you just have to walk away because you're never going to know.
So did you then walk away without knowing what would come next? Or did lavender come to you and they convinced you to go to them?
It's so funny when you quit a job and have nothing else, it's like people start knocking on your door, which you don't think will happen. So I quit in December. And then about 2 weeks later, I got a DM from Lavender and they had said, hey, we're looking at this role for community. Would you be interested? And initially I said, I don't want to go back to full-time work. It took me a lot to quit and make the decision to go off on my own. And it was really more about the team and the problem that they were solving that drew me to it. But there was a gap between making the decision to leave and actually that offer.
What were the other things you were considering at the time? Debating between, do I go and work for someone else? Do I work for myself in this moment? I mean, it sounded like you were gaining confidence. You had these sort of side gigs. What then were you comparing when Lavender comes? And you must have been a huge get for them, by the way. So
thanks.
It's an interesting place to be in. Where were you? I guess what I'm saying is my sense is you were drawn to this entrepreneurial, I want to be my own boss type, run my own business. Is it that you got scared and spooked? Or is it that Lavender came in and it was like this opportunity that you just could not pass up? Or both?
I think honestly it was a little bit of both, right? I at the time, so when all this happened, it was December. I was getting married that March and I had, I think 15 different sales kickoffs I was speaking at. So I'm not going to sit here and say I was looking around being I've got nothing to do. And well, it wasn't that, but I think there's always a little part of me that has that fear of, well, what if this is the best that happens? And when I leave, I become irrelevant. And so I'm sure that was at play for a part of it. But I think it was also, if you look at the commonalities in my career, when I worked at CEB, that was about best practice functional research, helping leaders rethink assumptions that they held around what makes them successful. Then you look at Challenger, it was a data-driven approach to figuring out what makes sales professionals successful and helping people rethink that. And then you look at Lavender and it was helping people rethink their assumptions about what works in a cold email. So there's definitely a common theme throughout all of those kind of companies that I worked for. And I think that was a big part of the pool is I myself had struggled a lot with cold emails when I was earlier in my career, and to find something that could help. I think I'm really drawn to things like that because so many of us are looking around saying, well, someone's telling me to do this and someone's telling me to do that. Those two things are at conflict. How do I make a decision?
Yeah. So then you end up at Lavender, but you were only there for a year. So then what happened again? Because now you are finally the end of the story, and then we're done. 6 minutes in, 5 minutes in. No. Because then you ended up leaving Lavender after a year and going out on your own. What happened in that year that then gave you the confidence to leave again?
It's actually a very good question because like I said, I was a little bit worried that my success had more to do with my company, my last company, Challenger, than me. When I went to Lavender and I saw that I just continued to grow and get more speaking opportunities and have more opportunities where it felt like people really valued my perspective, I think that actually gave me more confidence because it wasn't okay, it was just this thing that worked at this one company you worked for forever. And so it was around August timeframe where I just felt that pull again. And I was like, I can sit here and kick it down, the line again and again. But I think making that decision to leave Challenger was so hard for me because it was the first time I had ever done it. It was really the first job I ever had. I just stayed there forever. And so having done it once, I think gave me a ton of confidence to be you can do this again. And don't worry about what people think, or if people think you can't be cut out for a startup. That was the big kind of narrative in my head of people are going to say, oh, she couldn't cut it. And I was like, what do I really care if people think that? People who know me know that's not the truth.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so courageous because I think most of the time when people make a pivot, they think about it forever. And at least in my personal situation, I was working at a startup. I was, doing really well. I'd been there for forever in startup years. And I started working on Parentally. And it's funny because when you were talking about doing these side gigs and gaining confidence, that was kind of my Parentally story, which is I was building it on the side and it was working. But even then, I did not have the courage to quit for a variety of reasons. And luckily, the company I was at was acquired by WeWork, and then they blew up and we all got fired. And that, I don't know how long it would have taken me to get the confidence to actually quit and do this without a major push. And it sounds like in both scenarios, it wasn't that you were being pushed so much as you were going out and exploring. And then you made that decision of I want to actually do this now for real.
Yeah, and I think if you look at my career, so every 2 years across my career, I kind of made at least a little bit of a switch. So like I started off in account management, and then I went to like a cross-sell upsell motion, and then I went to net new business, and then I went to big game hunting. And I felt like there was always this 2-year itch. And that was the other thing. Having the opportunity to create that chief evangelist role was an incredible gift, right? But then after that, I was also kind of looking around and saying, well, what's my next thing? And I just didn't see it inside of the business. And it's no fault of the business. It was just more of like, if I don't see it, I have to create what I want.
So now that you are running your own business, and I know you're still figuring out exactly what direction you're going to take that in, I'm curious to hear how you will avoid that 2-year itch, because when I started Parentally, I was a one-woman show, and that's what I wanted. Fast forward to about actually exactly 2 years in, and I was like, this is way too slow. I need to raise money, build a team, grow much faster. Where are you in that life cycle with this business?
So this is a really fascinating thing for me. I think when I first left, I really struggled with the notion of not having something to fix. Like I realized I was so wired to always look around and be like, that's broken, let me fix it. That's broken, let me fix it. And then you walk off and you start your own thing, and there's nothing but things to fix and create, right? And so it was like, I remember the first week I had off, for my old job, I was trying to create a website. I don't know anything about creating a website. I was trying to do all these things, and I had someone call me that I respect, and they were like, what have you been doing this week? Because I think they knew I would struggle with it. I was like, well, here, I've been doing this and this and this. And they were just like, why? Why don't you just take a minute, figure out what you really want to do before you start building? And so it was a really hard switch for me. I think way harder than I anticipated to actually just like slow down a bit. But I think where I'm at in this stage of my life, I mean, you and I have spoken about this. I just got married in last March, so I'm not even a year into that. It's the first time I've ever been married, and my husband has 4 kids. And so if I reflect on my life, it was like the first, 20 years of my working career, my job was everything. My job was how I assigned my self-worth. My job was how I felt about myself. If I was performing well, I felt great about myself. If I was performing poorly, I was a mess. And so I think at this stage of my life, one of the things that I've been trying to be really intentional about is not falling into that same trap now, because I have something else that matters to me so much. So it's not to say I don't care about working. It's not to say I don't want to set a great example for my children of working. I just don't want work to be the defining thing of how I assign my self-worth.
And how did you switch over to feel that way? Was that a result of your relationship, the children, or was there something else? Like what? Because to switch your identity from career to not just your career is huge.
I think it was a lot of, when you make the decision, you did it. When you make the decision to leave a job, you do so much self-reflection, so much more than I think than we're often capable of doing when we're really in it. And so I think one part of it was certainly recognizing this feeling like there was never going to be enough. There's never going to be enough things I could do that I felt like it was enough and that I could calm down or be good with where I was at. And so I just kept raising my own bar, and it had nothing to do with the companies I work for. It had everything to do with me. So realizing that, I was like, gosh, you're always going to be chasing this feeling that you're never going to actually fulfill. That was one. And then 2 is just the reality of it's 3:30, your kids bust through the door. They want to see you. They're excited to tell you about your day. When I was not married and didn't have kids, I just didn't have that, right? So there was nothing preventing me from not working. And so as stupid and silly as it sounds, it's like that door kicking open was a really good alert to me. Like I've been staring at a computer screen for 6 hours and haven't left the house. So that's why I'm very grateful to it, because I think without it, I'm the type of person that just gets sucked into always doing something.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend the other day about how wild it is that back when I worked at Managed by Q, pre-children, I was married, but I didn't have children. My entire identity was this company. And to the point that I would catch myself talking to my husband and I realize I'm not even listening to him. Like I'm literally just thinking about work around the clock. Every piece of my self-worth was wrapped up in that experience and that job. And that it is so interesting to me that now I'm the face of my company. It's my company. Like everything I do is actually about this company. And if anything, now this should be my identity.
Right.
And I do not feel that way at all. I mean, obviously it's very important to me, but it doesn't feel like my identity in the way that this like silly startup job did before. You know, it's almost backwards.
I think it's so much healthier. And I think sometimes, obviously I don't know the organization that you work for or the leaders that you work for, but sometimes, particularly in startup, I've found it's like, it's almost made to be the norm. Like if you're going to work in startup, it's got to be the grind and you've got to get, like, what are we talking about? There are moments where I was like, what am I doing? I'm not curing cancer here. Like I'm helping people write emails better. Like why am I losing sleep over this? And so I think to some extent, the culture of the organization can drive some of that too. And now you're setting your own culture. I'm setting my own culture. And I do think that has a huge impact on how we choose to feel about ourselves and what we value.
Yeah. And I think back to the point of this podcast, I actually think that when my identity is not wrapped up in the company, I can make better decisions. And so I actually think that the company is doing better because I'm not going to work around the clock and I'm not going to work every single weekend. And so I have to make decisions. I have to make better decisions. So yeah, I totally like resonate with what you're saying. Let's talk about your journey into parenthood, because most people become parents suddenly, right? They have a baby. So they went from not being a parent to all of a sudden being like, oh my gosh, what is this thing? Or they adopt. And so similar motion, right? It's like the child arrives and they didn't know the child before. You had a very gradual entry into parenthood. I'm curious if you can share more about what that was like.
Yeah. So just as context, I met my husband on an online dating service, like most of us do these days. And he had 4 children. So they are now, when I met them, they were 5 through 15. Now, obviously, it's a few years later. So the 2 oldest children, my husband and his first wife were divorced kind of early in their 20s. They were college sweethearts, like really amicable relationship, really solid relationship. So we spent 50-50 with them. And then the younger 2 children, their mom passed away unexpectedly. And so obviously the circumstances of him dating were really, really sensitive. And so when I met him, it was an interesting situation because we had to decide, like, is this something we're going to take seriously or is this something we're just going to casually date, which is kind of weird pressure on top of already having pressure when you first meet someone. And so when he introduced the kids to me, I was very much like, this is my friend Jen. And for the first 6 or 7 months, it was, my friend Jen is coming over. And every time I showed up, it was cupcakes and puppies and like all the good things. And so it was a very gradual introduction. But in many ways, I think this is going to sound obvious, but like you don't really get a picture of what it's like to be a stepmom just by coming by and always being the one that's like bringing candy and fun stuff and doing fun things. And so after about 6 or 7 months, we made the decision to let the kids know. And they were massively supportive. They're amazing kids. And I moved in. And that was when it was like, that's when it for me felt like a sudden transition, because I went from someone who was living by themselves downtown Chicago, like everything I did was selfish. Every decision I made was for me. And then I moved to the suburbs of Chicago, and all of a sudden now it's like there is no alone time. There is no selfish time. And I think in many ways I struggled in the beginning a bit because I felt this responsibility to be like, I have to be there and I have to give everything that I have because they don't have, the younger 2 don't have a mom. And so I think and I talk about this with my husband a lot, like I think I kind of lost myself in the beginning because I was so focused on just being 100% there for them, because that's what in my mind I perceived motherhood to be, is like, it's all about your kids and not about you.
Did that impact, where were you in your career journey at that point? Was that when you were at Lavender or were you still at Challenger?
I was still at Challenger, yeah.
Okay. How did that, or did it not affect that sort of timeline and the career arc that we discussed before?
I think it did. I mean, I don't think at the time I realized it did, but I was doing a ton of travel at that time. I was having to leave, home a lot. And normally that wouldn't have been an issue, but it just felt like I had something I was leaving that I wanted to stay with. And I think that caused me to reconsider, like, is this the right role for me and what I want out of my life. And I think part of me struggled with it because I was like, oh, is this just like me conceding to motherhood, and like motherhood takes all the things away that are important to you? And then I realized it really wasn't that. It was like, this is really what I want to spend time doing. My job didn't really, like, I don't want to say my job didn't allow it, but my job made it hard. And so when you feel two things pulling apart from each other, I think you naturally go where you want to spend more time.
Do you have any rules now, boundaries that you put into place? Are there certain things as it relates to parenthood that you are just like non-starters? Like you won't travel more than X, or you won't be gone for more than Y days?
I wouldn't say it. I'm terrible with boundaries, Allison. That's a whole nother podcast. Terrible with that. But I am really mindful about when I travel, I'm trying to minimize the time away from home as much as possible. So I'll be the one that's like up at 3 so I can get the 6 a.m. flight. And if I can do it in a day and be back, then I do it. But one of the things, and this is why I appreciate my husband so much, that's been helpful, is my husband will actually encourage me. And he'll say, take the extra day. If you're going to New York and you're just going to go to a meeting, like take an extra day and go do something that you like. And I think that's really helpful for me because I tend to have this like really critical point of view about myself of like, well, I should be doing this instead of that. And that's where I think the partnership has really been helpful between me and my husband to remind me of things that I probably should be telling myself to begin with.
Yeah. Tell me about what it's like to be the step parent to teenagers. Because I do not have teenagers. I have no idea what's coming towards me, much less like, you enter their life at a later stage. I can't even imagine what that is like.
I actually think teenagers are awesome. Like we've got,
oh, good.
like I think there's always these horror stories, and some of it I'm sure is also our children. I'm sure everybody thinks their children are the best, but the children have been through hard things, right? So it's like that I think shapes them in a way that I don't think I appreciated coming into it. So their perspective or their point of view around what's hard is very different because of the loss that they had. And so in a way, I think teenagers are really cool because you start to see them showing who their future selves will be. So for example, our third oldest child, Ryan, she last year was really interested in public speaking. And so she auditioned to be one of her graduation speakers. This is 2 years ago, I'm sorry. She auditioned to be a graduation speaker. She goes to a massive school. There were like thousands of people at graduation. And so to see her stand up there and like have this confidence and speak vulnerably, I was like, this is so cool in a way that, going to a band concert when someone's 6 is just like a little bit different. So that's the part of it I think is like actually super, super cool, particularly with girls.
Yeah. Let's talk about girls, women in sales. So you're on the board, or you're an advisor to women in sales. And I know you've spoken to me about how mentorship is really important to you. What role does that play in your day-to-day now?
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things. I actually had a friend of mine, like I wrote a post about women in sales last year, and he was like, you don't really talk about it that much. And I reflected on it. I was like, you're right. I don't really do it. I mentored a lot of women, but I wasn't really loudly talking about it on LinkedIn. And I realized I think that was a bit of a disservice because I was very fortunate to grow up in sales with really phenomenal women managers. And I think that's very rare. And so I learned a lot of lessons. I was shaped in a way that I think made me successful regardless of whether my boss or my customer was like a woman or a man. But not all women have that. And I think some women, I hate making generalized statements, but I think in general, some women really struggle to ask for help. And particularly when it comes to selling, because they already feel like people are going to think I can't do it anyway. And so when I met Alexine, who founded Women in Sales, what I loved about it wasn't this like men are the enemy and let's bond together and let's gripe about. It was really truly a group of people who are like, we want to be amazing at sales and we want to lift each other up. And that was the first time I felt like it wasn't a griping session. It was much more of a productive, like elevate each other. Let's help each other build the right set of skills. And that's what totally sucked me into it. Because I think, in my opinion, that is the way that we get better and we, elevate ourselves in organizations.
What is it that draws you the most to like women in sales as opposed to just like mentorship in sales? Like, what is it about supporting women other than there just aren't that many women in leadership? Is that the thing? Or is there something else that really draws you like Why does that give you energy?
I think because I find in the conversations, I have a lot of conversations with people that'll reach out and be like, hey, can I, pick your brain about something? And like I said, I've had a lot of people that were generous with their time, so I try to be generous with mine. And I find that women, more so than men, just have such a level of self-doubt when they shouldn't. And I think sometimes it's just they need a voice of validation to say, everybody else is running their sales calls like this, or they're writing their emails like this. But to me, in my gut, I feel like that's wrong and I feel like I should do this. And I'm sitting there saying, you're absolutely right. Like, your gut is what makes you have a superpower in sales. But when you look around, a lot of the voices, and I'm sure you see this too, like you go on LinkedIn and it's like, tag your 10 favorite creators, and it's just a list of 10 dudes. And so I think part of why I do it and why it's so important to me is because eventually I'm going to get really old and crusty and dusty, and I'm not going to write on LinkedIn anymore, and I'm not going to do podcasts. And I want there to be a massive line of people ready to take that over. And that's the thing I worry about is, like, even with podcasting, it can be really difficult to find women that feel confident in their voice to speak up, even though they have every reason to.
Right. I think the confidence piece is huge. And as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about a woman who worked for me. She was an enterprise sales rep. And then when didn't work out and we were all sent on our merry way, she was interviewing, and she was a great sales rep, but she didn't present as like aggressive. She was a little bit quieter and well-spoken and soft-spoken. And I will never forget when she was interviewing for a huge tech company, like where everyone wants to work in sales. And the manager called me, the hiring manager, and he was asking me and he had, a generic question. Oh, how was she? And I just decided, I think I must have been tired. And I just came out of the gates like, all right, I can guess what your concern is. She's very quiet. And he's like, oh, yes, I know. I can't believe she's in sales. And it was like, she ended up getting the job because I was like, this is your concern. I know it. She is amazing. Let me tell you why. Not being super aggressive in your face, like, is not necessarily always the right thing when everyone out there is doing that. So I think that confidence piece, it's like, I don't know. I think a lot about the confidence, but also how you present. They're not the same thing. And I think that that's what this person was worried about is, her lack of confidence. She doesn't have a lack of confidence. She's just soft-spoken.
And that's the thing, particularly with sales interviews, this is the thing that's always driven me mad. It's like, what do people look for? I want the person that can like win over the room. And I want the person that's like, very confident. Well, that in many cases is exactly the opposite of what makes for a great salesperson. It what made a great salesperson in the 1950s. But like today, buyers know a lot. They don't want someone who's like taking over the room and so confident. They want someone who actually will listen and pay attention and make thoughtful suggestions. And it's just, I find that our profession is like so slow to keep up with that. And I agree completely with what you said. You can have someone who wows you in an interview and then totally sucks at sales because they don't get any of those like really important basics right. And so, yeah, that story I feel like is a tale as old as time for women with sales.
Okay, I want to end with, we've been calling this like hot takes / quick takes, but I'm going to throw out a word or a phrase, and I want you to just share the first thing that comes to your mind.
Oh, boy.
Don't worry. And you don't have to go do with it what you want, but we've done this recently and it's worked well. LinkedIn versus TikTok.
Oh, productive versus unhealthy.
Your hardest parenting decision. Or a recent hard parenting decision.
Oh my goodness, this is a hard one. Okay, I have one. Talking to your kids about them feeling anxiety. Such a like tricky subject because you don't want to teach them something that maybe then they're like, okay, that's a thing, now I have it. So talking about anxiety with our youngest has been really, really challenging.
See, these are the things that I just want to not hear. And childcare,
expensive.
Most embarrassing sales fail.
Oh, easy. I was selling to like a Fortune 20 company, a logo anyone would know. I worked this deal for like 7 months. I thought I had a deal, and I was selling to someone who I like had no authority, no ability to do anything. I realized it really late, and I made a cardinal sin. I went above his head, went to the president of the company and just said, hey, I've been talking to so-and-so about this. The president forwarded him the email, was like, why are you talking to a vendor about this? I've been clear that we're not outsourcing this. And then the guy called my boss, told him that he should fire me, that I was a terrible person. He hangs up with him. My boss calls me. He's like, get ready for a phone call. The guy calls me and just reams into me to the point where I was sobbing on the phone, and he still didn't stop. And then a couple months later, he got fired. So I think that's probably why he was so mad. So that was my worst.
Yikes. That's a good one. Proudest career moment?
I think it was creating the job of chief evangelist at Challenger. It was the first time I ever put my neck out there to say, like, I believe this job should exist. It doesn't. I asked for what I wanted and I got it. And then that's not something a younger Jen would have done.
Love it. I'm going to end on that high note. Last thing I'll ask is, if people want to find you, work with you, what are you doing these days? What is on your menu of what you can offer?
Yes. So LinkedIn, and then demandgen.com with a J, not a G. We're getting into heavy sales kickoff season. So I do a lot of kickoffs for sales teams who are saying, look, my teams are struggling with how to sell to today's buyers. So I talk about things like prospecting and selling to group consensus and competing against status quo. So that's the big thing. But I also do virtual training workshops for sales teams as well, primarily around prospecting and writing great cold emails.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was fascinating, and I wish we had another hour, but I love this.
Me too. You're so lovely.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The False Trade-Off. Make sure to subscribe if you like what you heard, and give us a follow on LinkedIn to continue the conversation on all things working parenthood and parental leave. Is there a topic you'd love us to cover in a future episode? Drop us an email at hello@parentally.com. And if you're looking for support on preparing for parental leave, head over to www.parentally.com. We have checklists, guides, and other free resources to help you make the experience a little bit easier. That's PARENTALY.com.